At 2 in the afternoon on the 19th of October, 1781, the largest British army in North America surrendered on a muddy field in Virginia. 7,000 soldiers marched out of the shattered tobacco port of Yorktown to lay down their arms. Their drums beat a slow march between two lines of Allied troops that stretched for more than a mile. On one side stood the regiments of the French Expeditionary Force, their white coats immaculate. On the other waited the Continental Army, their uniforms patched and threadbare, but their lines straight. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis, the British commander, was nowhere to be seen. He claimed illness and remained behind the ruined earthworks. In his place rode Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, Cornwallis's second-in-command, on horseback. O'Hara approached the Allied commanders at the head of the British column. He rode first toward the Comte de Rochambeau, commander of the French forces. O'Hara offered his sword to the French general, a deliberate attempt to slight the Americans. Rochambeau refused the gesture with a shake of his head. He directed O'Hara toward General George Washington, who stood with his staff on the American side of the road. Washington saw O'Hara approaching and refused to accept the sword himself. Instead, he gestured toward Major General Benjamin Lincoln, his own second-in-command. Lincoln had been humiliated at the surrender of Charleston the year before. Now he stepped forward and accepted the sword from O'Hara. The British soldiers marched between the Allied ranks to a designated field. Many of them wept openly as they passed. Some cursed under their breath. Men threw down their muskets with such force that the locks shattered. Others flung their cartridge boxes and bayonets onto the growing pile of surrendered weapons. German mercenaries from the regiments of Ansbach and Bayreuth did the same, their faces hard with exhaustion. The Allied soldiers stood in silence as the column passed. Washington had ordered that no jeering or triumphal celebration be permitted. The British band played a slow tune as the defeated army marched. Tradition later claimed the piece was called "The World Turned Upside Down." Yet no contemporary diary or letter records the exact song that was played that afternoon. The story may be a later embellishment, but the image of an upside-down world captured the reality perfectly. More than 8,000 British, German, and Loyalist soldiers became prisoners of war. This was the largest surrender of British forces in one place until the fall of Singapore in 1942. When the news reached London, the political will to continue the war collapsed. Parliament had poured millions of pounds into the American conflict for 6 years. Now the entire southern British army was gone. Yet the surrender at Yorktown concealed a deeper contradiction. The popular image of the American Revolution painted it as a victory of a tiny, ragtag rebel army over the might of the British Empire. The truth on the ground at Yorktown was starkly different. Cornwallis faced a combined Franco-American force of approximately 16,000 soldiers. The British and their German allies numbered between 8,000 and 9,000. The besiegers outnumbered the besieged nearly 2 to 1. French artillery and French engineering had been decisive from the first day of the siege. French warships controlled the Chesapeake Bay, blocking any British escape or relief by sea. The question that hung over the muddy surrender field was not simply how the British lost. It was how an alliance of former enemies had moved an entire army 400 miles and trapped Cornwallis before he could escape. The answer lay in a chain of strategic decisions, miscommunications, and gambles that stretched from the Caribbean to New York. The road to Yorktown began months earlier, in the summer of 1781, when Cornwallis made a fateful choice in the southern colonies. In May of 1781, Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis marched into Virginia at the head of 7,000 British and German troops. He had spent the previous year fighting a brutal campaign through Georgia and the Carolinas. The Southern strategy had seemed brilliant on paper in London. British commanders believed the southern colonies teemed with loyalists eager to rise up for the crown. Control the South, the logic ran, and the rebellion would fracture along regional lines. Royal governors would return, loyal subjects would enlist, and the Continental Army would lose its southern flank entirely. The reality on the ground bore almost no resemblance to this optimistic vision. Cornwallis had won tactical victories at Camden, Guilford Courthouse, and Hobkirk's Hill. But each victory bled his army without breaking the rebellion. Loyalist militias proved smaller, less reliable, and more scattered than London had promised. Patriot militia and guerrilla fighters under men like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter harassed British supply lines constantly. Every time Cornwallis crushed one pocket of resistance, another flared up behind him. By the spring of 1781, his army was exhausted, undersupplied, and far from any reliable base. He decided to move the war into Virginia without explicit authorization from his superior, General Sir Henry Clinton in New York. Virginia was the largest, wealthiest, and most populous of the former colonies. It fed the Continental Army with grain, livestock, and recruits. Cornwallis reasoned that striking deep into Virginia would force the Americans to divert resources from other theaters. He also believed a decisive campaign there might finally rally the Loyalist support that had failed to materialize further south. His troops crossed the Roanoke River into southern Virginia on the 20th of May. They burned tobacco warehouses, seized horses and supplies, and scattered the small militia detachments that tried to oppose them. The British cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton rode ahead of the main column, raiding plantations and destroying stores of food and ammunition. Cornwallis linked up with a British raiding force already operating in Virginia under Brigadier General William Phillips. When Phillips died of typhus on the 13th of May, his command passed briefly to the traitor Benedict Arnold before merging into Cornwallis's larger army. This gave Cornwallis nearly 8,000 men, a formidable field army by the standards of the American war. But the campaign lacked a clear strategic objective beyond destruction. Cornwallis chased the small American army of the Marquis de Lafayette across central Virginia through June and early July. Lafayette, outnumbered and commanding inexperienced militia, refused to be drawn into a pitched battle. He retreated north toward the Rappahannock River, keeping his force intact and waiting for reinforcements. Cornwallis grew frustrated with the fruitless pursuit. He burned stores at Point of Fork, dispersed Virginia's legislature from Charlottesville, and sent Tarleton on a lightning raid that nearly captured Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. Jefferson escaped with minutes to spare, but the psychological impact of a British army rampaging through the Virginia heartland was profound. Still, no popular Loyalist uprising materialized. The local population remained sullen, hostile, or simply absent. Cornwallis received orders from General Clinton in late June that redirected the entire campaign. Clinton, increasingly anxious about French naval movements in the Caribbean, instructed Cornwallis to select and fortify a deep-water port on the Virginia coast. The British Navy needed a permanent base in the Chesapeake to control the bay and support operations in the Middle Colonies. Clinton suggested Old Point Comfort at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. Cornwallis sent engineers to survey the site, and they deemed it unsuitable. The ground was too low, too marshy, and too difficult to fortify against a landward attack. Cornwallis chose instead a small tobacco port on the southern bank of the York River, called Yorktown. Yorktown sat on a low bluff overlooking the York River, roughly 12 miles from the river's mouth at the Chesapeake Bay. The town itself was a cluster of brick and wooden buildings, perhaps 60 or 70 houses in total, surrounded by open farmland and patches of forest. Cornwallis began fortifying the position in early August. He also occupied Gloucester Point, a narrow spit of land directly across the river from Yorktown on the northern bank. Together, the two positions controlled the York River Channel and offered a protected anchorage for British warships and supply vessels. British soldiers and German engineers immediately began digging earthworks. They constructed a series of redoubts, batteries, and connecting trenches in a crescent-shaped arc around the landward side of Yorktown. Pointed stakes known as abatis lined the forward slopes of the defensive works. The York River behind the town was deep enough to accommodate ships of the line, but only barely. To build the fortifications, Cornwallis seized upon the labor of thousands of enslaved African Americans. Throughout the Southern campaign, both the British and the Americans had employed enslaved people for manual labor. The British had issued the 1779 Philipsburg Proclamation, promising freedom to any enslaved person who escaped Patriot owners and reached British lines. Many thousands took the offer, fleeing plantations across Virginia and the Carolinas. The British used them as laborers, guides, servants, and workers on the fortifications. At Yorktown, Cornwallis put hundreds of enslaved men to work with shovels, picks, and wheelbarrows. They dug trenches under the punishing Virginia summer sun, their hands blistered and their bodies exposed to artillery fire. Cornwallis expected the British Royal Navy to keep the York River open and to secure his supply line from the sea. This expectation was the most dangerous miscalculation of the entire campaign. Cornwallis assumed that the British fleet, operating from New York and the Caribbean, could always match or overmatch any French naval force in American waters. He had no way of knowing that a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was already en route from the West Indies. De Grasse had sailed from Saint-Domingue with 27 ships of the line, a warship count that exceeded anything the British could concentrate in one place on short notice. Cornwallis saw the deep anchorage at Yorktown as a lifeline. He failed to see it for what it would become once French ships closed the mouth of the Chesapeake. A deep-water port without naval supremacy is not a refuge. It is a trap with the sea at your back. By the third week of August, Cornwallis's army was positioned on the narrow peninsula between the York and James rivers. Lafayette's American force, now reinforced with Continental regulars under General Anthony Wayne, hovered to the west near Williamsburg. Cornwallis still believed he could hold his position indefinitely as long as the Navy controlled the bay. He had fortified his lines, stockpiled ammunition, and positioned more than 100 artillery pieces to defend the approaches. His 8,000 troops included seasoned British regiments like the 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers and the 33rd Foot, along with Hessian infantry and Ansbach-Bayreuth grenadiers. The defensive works at Yorktown grew more formidable each day. Palm logs reinforced the earthen parapets. Cannon barrels peered through embrasures cut into the packed soil. The British dug a series of 4 main redoubts on the outer perimeter and prepared a secondary line closer to the town. At Gloucester Point, a smaller British force under Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton dug in behind separate fortifications. Cornwallis sent dispatches to Clinton in New York, requesting supplies, reinforcements, and assurance that the fleet would arrive before any serious threat materialized. Clinton promised relief. He did not specify when or in what strength, and so, in late August 1781, the most powerful British army in the southern colonies sat behind its earthworks at Yorktown. It waited for ships that were not coming. It faced an enemy that was already on the move. The trap had not yet closed, but the door was beginning to swing shut. On the 14th of August, 1781, a mud-spattered dispatch rider galloped into the Continental Army's camp above the Hudson River. He carried a letter that would redirect the entire war. The message came from Admiral François-Joseph Paul, Comte de Grasse. De Grasse commanded the French West Indies fleet at Saint-Domingue. He informed General Washington that he was sailing north with his entire armada. 27 ships of the line and 7 frigates were bound for the Chesapeake Bay. The fleet would carry 3 regiments of French infantry under the Marquis de Saint-Simon. De Grasse intended to arrive in late August and remain only until the middle of October. Washington read the letter and summoned the Comte de Rochambeau without delay. The two commanders had spent the summer negotiating their next move. Washington had pressed for an assault on the British garrison at New York City. Rochambeau had preferred a southern operation, closer to the French fleet. The dispatch from de Grasse settled the argument with the weight of a naval sledgehammer. The Chesapeake Bay was where they would strike. Washington and Rochambeau met in a candlelit room at the Odell farmhouse near Dobbs Ferry. Maps covered the table. They traced the road south with their fingers and weighed the odds. The plan they discarded was no small thing. Abandoning the New York offensive meant leaving General Sir Henry Clinton's army of 10,000 men unchallenged. Clinton could strike the remaining American forces in the Hudson Highlands. He could march into New Jersey and break the rebellion's supply lines. He could even descend on Philadelphia while the main army was 400 miles away. The British fleet in New York also remained intact. If Admiral Graves sailed south to challenge de Grasse, the whole enterprise could collapse. Washington and Rochambeau accepted these risks with a single, shared nod. They would gamble the Northern Theater for a decisive blow in Virginia. Between the 19th and 21st of August, 4,000 French soldiers and 2,500 Americans began crossing the Hudson River at King's Ferry. Flat-bottomed boats ferried men, horses, and cannon across the gray water. The column stretched for miles along the muddy tracks. Soldiers marched under a late summer sun that baked their wool uniforms stiff with sweat. Most of them had no idea where they were going. Secrecy was absolute. Washington had left behind a small rump force under Major General William Heath. Heath's orders were to convince Clinton that the entire Continental Army was still camped in the Hudson Valley. Fake bake ovens rose on the slopes near Verplancks Point. Engineers laid pontoons across the Hackensack River as if preparing an amphibious assault on Staten Island. Skeleton units maintained rows of tents and lit campfires at dusk. Couriers rode south with bogus dispatches meant for British interception. The deception held long enough. Clinton remained fixed in New York, certain the real attack would come from the Hudson. Meanwhile, the Allied army pushed south through New Jersey at a punishing pace. They tramped past abandoned farms and scorched orchards. Dust caked the faces of the French regulars in their white uniforms. The American Continentals, ragged and underfed, kept step with their French allies. On the 2nd of September, the head of the column marched through Philadelphia. The streets were lined with cheering crowds. Washington rode at the front with Rochambeau at his side. The sight of the Allied army parading in tight order gave a jolt of confidence to the nervous city. From Philadelphia, the troops pushed on to Head of Elk, on the northern shore of the Chesapeake. There they began loading onto transports for the final leg by water. 400 miles away, de Grasse was already entering the Virginia Capes. On the 30th of August, the lookouts on his flagship, the Ville de Paris, spotted the low green shore of Cape Henry. The French battle line, 27 ships of the line stretching across the horizon, sailed into the Chesapeake Bay in column. Signal flags snapped from the yards. Sailors scrambled to reef and furl as the Armada dropped anchor in Lynnhaven Bay. It was the largest single naval force to enter American waters during the entire war. De Grasse wasted no time. He ordered the 3,000 infantry under Saint-Simon to begin landing immediately. Boats splashed into the warm brown water and rowed toward the muddy banks near Jamestown. The soldiers came ashore with muskets, cartridge boxes, and light artillery. They marched inland and linked up with Lafayette's force near Williamsburg. The noose around Cornwallis was now drawing tighter by land. The French fleet's arrival changed the strategic equation overnight. For the first time in the war, the Allies possessed undisputed naval control of a major American waterway. Cornwallis, digging his fortifications at Yorktown, did not yet know that the mouth of the Chesapeake was sealed. He still expected British sails on the horizon. He still trusted that the Royal Navy would ride to his rescue. But the ships now filling the bay flew the white banner of the Bourbon fleur-de-lis. The door that had been swinging shut was now locked from the outside. On the morning of the 5th of September, lookouts on the French frigates spotted sails on the northeastern horizon. The British fleet had come. Rear Admiral Thomas Graves had sailed from New York with 19 ships of the line. He had been ordered to deliver reinforcements to Cornwallis and engage the French fleet if possible. Graves commanded the HMS London, a 90-gun three-decker flying his flag at the mizzen. His second-in-command, Rear Admiral Samuel Hood, had his flag aboard the HMS Barfleur. The 19 British ships formed a line that stretched across the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Below them, anchored in Lynnhaven Bay, the French Armada lay at rest. De Grasse had 24 ships of the line present that morning. 3 others were up the bay, ferrying St. Simon's troops to the James River. The French fleet was in a dangerously vulnerable position. Hundreds of officers and sailors were ashore, collecting fresh water and provisions. De Grasse had to get his ships into open water before Graves could trap them inside the bay. The tide was flooding, and the wind blew from the northeast. Every French captain understood that sailing out of the Chesapeake against wind and current would be agonizingly slow. De Grasse gave the signal to slip cables and get underway immediately. Crews scrambled aloft to loose topsails, while carpenters hacked at anchor cables with axes. The French ships began to warp out of the bay in single file, bows clawing against the incoming tide. It was a race against the wind, the current, and a British fleet already forming its battle line offshore. Graves watched the French column emerge and made a decision that baffled his own captains. He had the weather gauge, meaning the wind was behind him, and he could choose the moment of attack. A more aggressive admiral would have fallen on the French van, while the rest of their fleet struggled out of the narrow channel. Graves waited. He spent the morning issuing signals and forming his line of battle with painstaking precision. The French ships kept coming, one after another, slowly winning the open sea. By early afternoon, De Grasse had 24 ships of the line clearing the Virginia Capes. The brown water of the bay gave way to the gray-green swells of the Atlantic. Aboard the Ville de Paris, De Grasse ordered his ships into a line of battle heading eastward, parallel to the British. The two fleets now sailed on roughly the same course, the French to leeward, the British to windward. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the British van under Rear Admiral Drake closed within cannon range. The leading British ships hoisted their battle ensigns. The French responded in kind, running up the white flags of the Bourbon monarchy. The first broadside thundered from the British 74-gun HMS Shrewsbury. French gunners answered instantly, their 24 and 36-pounder cannon erupting in clouds of gray smoke. The engagement that followed lasted just over 2 hours. Only the lead ships, the vans and parts of the two centers, actually traded fire. Graves had issued a signal to engage the enemy line more closely, but he kept the crucial signal for line of battle flying simultaneously. These two flags contradicted each other, as every British captain understood. The line of battle signal required ships to maintain their rigid positions. The engagement signal required them to close with the enemy. Most captains obeyed the line of battle signal and held formation. The result was that the British Rear Division under Admiral Hood never entered the fighting at all. Hood's squadron of 6 powerful ships of the line sat miles away, watching the battle but unable to fire a single shot. In the van, the British took a savage pounding. The HMS Shrewsbury absorbed repeated broadsides and was reduced to a floating wreck with 80 men dead or wounded. The HMS Terrible, a 74-gun ship of the line, had her hull so badly shattered that she would never fight again. The French gunnery aimed high into the British rigging, shredded sails, snapped masts, and cut signal lines. As dusk fell, the cannonade tapered off. Smoke hung over the water in a gray pall that hid both fleets from each other. No ships had been sunk. No magazine had exploded. The Battle of the Chesapeake was, by the narrow measure of ships captured or destroyed, tactically inconclusive. Its strategic consequences were absolute. For the next 5 days, the two fleets drifted south together in a strange, parallel procession. Neither admiral sought a decisive renewal of the engagement. Graves held councils of war aboard the London and heard his captains report the damage to their ships. The Terrible was taking on water faster than her pumps could manage. The Shrewsbury's mainmast threatened to topple over the side. On the 10th of September, Graves made the decision to break off. He turned his battered fleet north and set course for New York to refit and repair. The Royal Navy had abandoned the Chesapeake Bay. De Grasse sailed back into the bay the same day, his fleet intact and now completely unchallenged. He found an unexpected gift awaiting him. While de Grasse had been fighting Graves off the Capes, Admiral de Barras had slipped down from Newport, Rhode Island. De Barras had 8 ships of the line, plus siege artillery and ammunition from Rochambeau's magazines. The combined French fleet now numbered 36 ships of the line. It was the largest naval force ever assembled in North American waters during the Age of Sail. French officers recorded the sight in their logs with barely concealed astonishment. For the first time in the long history of Anglo-French naval warfare, a French fleet had outmaneuvered and outlasted the British in a direct strategic contest. Graves had not been defeated in a blaze of sinking ships. He had been defeated by indecision, rigid adherence to outdated tactics, and a catastrophic failure of communication between himself and his flag officers. The Royal Navy's own after-action reports would spend decades arguing over who was to blame. The argument did not matter to the men huddled behind earthworks at Yorktown. Cornwallis scanned the horizon every morning, expecting to see British topsails. The horizon remained empty. With the Navy gone, the British Army in Virginia had no supply line, no reinforcement, and no escape route. Cornwallis's only remaining hope was a land relief from Clinton, marching down from New York. That army was never going to come. The main body of the Allied army began reaching Williamsburg in mid-September. French infantry in white uniforms marched alongside American Continentals in faded blue and brown. Washington and Rochambeau rode at the head of the converging columns. On September 14th, the advance elements of the French Expeditionary Force entered the town. Lafayette's smaller force had been shadowing Cornwallis for weeks. He had avoided a pitched battle and waited for the reinforcements that were now arriving. By September 24th, the entire Allied host had assembled at Williamsburg. Total Franco-American strength on the Virginia Peninsula reached roughly 16,000 men. The American contingent numbered about 8,800 Continentals and militia. The French contingent added approximately 7,800 regulars. 8,000 Redcoats and German auxiliaries huddled behind the earthworks at Yorktown. Cornwallis commanded between 8,300 and 9,000 troops, including loyalists. The Allies now outnumbered the British nearly 2-to-1 on the ground. French warships sealed the York River and the Chesapeake beyond. The trap was set. On the morning of September 28th, the Allied army stirred before dawn. Columns of infantry formed on the dusty roads outside Williamsburg. Washington gave the order to advance the 12 miles toward Yorktown. French troops took the road on the left, nearest the York River. American Continentals and militia marched on the right, swinging around the headwaters of Wormley Creek. Cavalry screens fanned out ahead to feel for British pickets. The day was bright and warm, the autumn leaves just beginning to turn. Drums beat the steppe as the long blue and white serpent of men coiled through the Virginia countryside. By late afternoon, the leading regiments crested the low ridges overlooking the British works. Cornwallis watched the Allied columns deploy across the fields in front of his lines. He could see the sheer scale of the force arrayed against him for the first time. The encirclement was methodical and complete. French regiments anchored the left flank against the river. American units sealed the right, curving inland to cut off any retreat toward the James. A smaller detachment of French cavalry and Virginia militia crossed the York River to blockade Gloucester Point on the opposite shore. Cornwallis had no avenue of escape left open. On September 30th, the British commander made a decision that baffled his own engineers. He ordered the outer line of defensive works abandoned. These fortifications consisted of 4 redoubts and connecting trenches that screened the main inner works. Cornwallis had received a dispatch from Clinton suggesting that a relief fleet might sail in early October. He believed the outer works were too weak to hold against a determined assault. He chose to pull his men back to the tighter inner perimeter, hoping to conserve strength. The Allies woke the next morning to find the British pickets gone. Patrols crept forward and discovered the redoubts empty. Washington immediately ordered the abandoned earthworks occupied and turned against their builders. Allied troops moved their forward positions up several hundred yards at no cost. Cornwallis had inadvertently handed the besiegers a closer platform to begin their work. The compression of the siege had begun in earnest. On the night of October 6th, the real labor started. Under a moonless sky, working parties of American and French soldiers crept forward with picks and shovels. Engineers had marked the trace of a trench line in the dark soil. The line ran roughly parallel to the British inner fortifications, about 600 yards distant. This was the first siege parallel, the opening move in a classical European siege technique developed by the French military engineer Vauban. The idea was brutally simple. Dig a trench parallel to the enemy walls, just outside effective musket range. Use it as a protected forward staging area for infantry and light artillery. Then dig zigzag approach saps forward toward the enemy works. Dig a second parallel closer still, and repeat. The entire system was designed to minimize casualties while squeezing the defender to the breaking point. Throughout the night, hundreds of men dug in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of shovels on hard-packed earth and the low commands of officers. British sentries heard nothing. By dawn on October 7th, the first parallel stretched for more than 2 miles in a sweeping arc. It was 6 feet deep in places, with a parapet of packed earth facing the enemy. Gun platforms had been carved into its length to receive heavy siege cannon. The Allies had gained a continuous fortified foothold just 600 yards from the British front line. The cannon themselves were arriving in a steady stream. French naval crews ferried massive siege guns from the ships in the bay up the narrow creeks. Teams of oxen and sweating soldiers dragged the barrels overland on sling carts. French 24-pounders and heavy mortars joined American 18-pounders in the battery positions. By October 9th, 52 heavy guns had been emplaced along the first parallel. French gunners manned the batteries on the left. American gunners under General Henry Knox occupied the right. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Washington himself touched off the first American gun. A plume of white smoke erupted from the battery as a round shot screamed toward the British lines. The French batteries opened an instant later. Within minutes, a continuous thunder rolled across the peninsula. Solid shot tore into the British earthworks and collapsed sections of parapet. Heated shot set several buildings inside Yorktown on fire. Mortar shells arced high and plunged directly into trench lines, exploding in bursts of iron splinters. The bombardment continued without pause through the night and into the next days. British gunners tried to reply, but their counters were smothered. Allied cannon systematically dismounted British artillery pieces one after another. Gun carriages splintered, barrels were knocked askew, and ammunition caissons detonated. By October 11th, Cornwallis's own artillery had been largely silenced. British soldiers lay face down in the bottom of their trenches, unable to move. The constant crash of incoming iron frayed nerves and shattered sleep. Morale inside the battered town crumbled under the unrelenting shell fire. On October 11th, the Allied engineers began driving a second siege parallel forward. Working parties dug the new trench line under constant harassment from British marksmen. The advance stopped roughly 350 yards from the British inner works. Two fortified earthen redoubts stood directly in the path of the digging. Redoubt number 9 anchored the British right, a square work with a palisade and deep ditch. Redoubt number 10 sat closer to the York River, smaller but equally well defended. Both positions bristled with abatis, felled trees with sharpened branches pointing outward. Each redoubt held a garrison of British and Hessian troops with light cannon. Without taking these strong points, the second parallel could never connect. Washington and Rochambeau agreed on a simultaneous night assault for October 14th. The plan divided the attack between the French and American wings. French regulars would storm the larger Redoubt 9 on the left. American light infantry would carry Redoubt 10 on the right near the river. A cannonade from the first parallel would mask the sound of the advancing columns. On the afternoon of October 14th, the assault troops moved into forward positions. Colonel Guillaume de Dupont commanded 400 French grenadiers and chasseurs. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton led an equal number of picked American light infantry. Hamilton's men came from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts regiments. They stripped off excess gear and fixed bayonets in the gathering dusk. Hamilton gave a deliberate and unusual order. His soldiers were to advance with their muskets completely unloaded. He wanted no accidental discharge to alert the defenders too early. The assault would be cold steel and momentum alone. At 8 o'clock, a single signal rocket hissed into the black sky. French drums beat the charge on the left. Dupont's column surged forward through the dark toward Redoubt 9. Hessian sentries shouted the alarm and opened fire at close range. Musket balls tore gaps in the French ranks. The attackers reached the abattis and began hacking through with axes. Hessian grenadiers stood atop the parapet, firing down at point-blank range. French soldiers clawed up the sloping earthwork and jumped into the trench. Bayonets clashed in the narrow confines of the redoubt. The fight inside Redoubt 9 became a furious hand-to-hand melee. Dupont himself was wounded in the face but refused to leave. His men rolled over the defenders with sheer momentum. After half an hour, the surviving Hessians threw down their arms. Redoubt 9 had fallen, but the French paid a heavy price. 56 French soldiers lay dead, and more than 100 wounded. Simultaneously, Hamilton's Americans sprinted toward Redoubt 10. They crossed 200 yards of open ground under little fire. The British had not expected a second attack from that direction. A lead team of sappers reached the abattis first. They pulled aside the sharpened logs with bare hands. Hamilton's main body poured through the gap without pausing. The men scrambled onto the parapet and poured into the fort. The British garrison, surprised and overwhelmed, fired only a ragged volley. American bayonets made short work of the resistance inside. No musket was discharged during the entire assault. The redoubt fell in less than 10 minutes of actual combat. Hamilton's force lost only 9 men killed and about 25 wounded. The entire operation, both assaults combined, concluded in under 30 minutes. Allied soldiers now stood inside the British forward defensive line. Engineers immediately went to work connecting the captured redoubts. By dawn, the second parallel extended in an unbroken arc. Gun crews hauled 24-pounders and mortars up to the new positions. The Allied artillery could now fire at barely 200 yards range. Every corner of the British camp sat within direct cannon shot. Cornwallis's command post itself lay under the arc of plunging mortar shells. His army was compressed into a shrinking pocket of shell-torn earth. The British commander recognized that his position had become catastrophic. Allied guns systematically smashed the remaining British artillery pieces. Food stores inside Yorktown dwindled to a few days' supply. Wounded men lay untreated in ruined buildings. Cornwallis decided on a desperate gamble to escape destruction. On the night of October 16th, he launched a breakout operation. Flat-bottomed boats assembled near the wharf under cover of darkness. A picked force of 350 men crossed the York River first. They were to seize the French outposts at Gloucester Point. The plan was to force open a corridor and evacuate the entire army. But weather over the Chesapeake shifted without warning. A violent storm struck the river at the most critical hour. Winds gusted to gale force, and rain lashed the water. The boats carrying Cornwallis's second wave were scattered downriver. Crews lost control, and several vessels capsized in the choppy swells. The men already ashore at Gloucester Point sat stranded without support. Dawn approached with the breakout force fragmented and exposed. Cornwallis had no choice but to abort the operation. He recalled the troops across the river as the storm raged on. The boats that could return ferried the men back under harrowing conditions. The failed sortie cost precious hours and the last shred of hope. Cornwallis's only remaining option was surrender. As the storm shredded his last hope of escape, a darker crisis festered inside the British lines. Cornwallis faced a brutal arithmetic of starvation. His army had consumed most of the food stockpiled in Yorktown. Every day of siege tightened the noose of hunger. He made a decision that condemned thousands to death. The British commander ordered all enslaved African Americans expelled from his fortifications. These were the same people who had fled to British lines under the Philipsburg Proclamation of 1779. They had built the earthworks, dug the trenches, cooked the meals. Now they were useless mouths eating dwindling rations. British soldiers shoved men, women, and children through the defensive perimeter at bayonet point. The column of expelled humanity stumbled into the no-man's land between the siege lines. They numbered somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 souls. Many wore only rags against the October chill. Smallpox swept through the unprotected mass within days. The British had already infected much of this population during their service in the camp. Now the disease exploded in the open with no shelter and no medicine. Starvation followed close behind the sickness. Men and women collapsed on the churned mud between the opposing trenches. Children cried for food that no one could provide. American and French sentries watched from their forward positions. Some threw scraps across the lines. Most simply watched as the human tide wasted away. The dead lay unburied in the shell-cratered ground for days. The smell of decay drifted over both armies. Allied patrols eventually moved into the strip of suffering. They seized hundreds of the escaped slaves who still survived. Some were returned to their former Patriot owners under standing legal orders. Others were simply absorbed as laborers for the Allied siege works. Washington's own army included both free and enslaved black soldiers in its ranks. The Rhode Island Regiment contained entire companies of African-American infantrymen who had earned freedom through service. This complicated truth sat uneasily alongside the re-enslavement happening simultaneously in the same camp. The fate of the expelled slaves remained one of the grimmest chapters of the Yorktown campaign. Most of those forced into no man's land never survived the siege. Inside the British perimeter, disease was equally merciless. Makeshift hospitals crammed into the ruined cellars of waterfront warehouses. Surgeons worked by candlelight on planks laid across barrels. They had no opium for pain and no clean linen for bandages. Gangrene spread through wounds that should have been survivable. The stench of rotting flesh filled every underground chamber. Men screamed through amputations performed with unsterilized saws. The British wounded from the artillery bombardment piled up faster than the surgeons could treat them. A single shell plunging into a packed trench could wound a dozen men at once. Those who survived the initial blast lay in the mud for hours before stretcher bearers could reach them. Many died of shock and blood loss while waiting. The dead were buried in shallow mass graves dug at night under sporadic fire. Above ground, the civilian town of Yorktown was being pulverized into rubble. The once thriving tobacco port had contained perhaps 60 frame houses and brick public buildings. Allied shells crashed through roofs and detonated inside rooms. Georgian-style homes that had stood for half a century collapsed into burning heaps. Thomas Nelson Jr., a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a Virginia governor, owned one of the finest houses in town. Tradition holds he directed American gunners to fire on his own residence, believing Cornwallis used it as a headquarters. Whether the story is precisely true or not, the house was destroyed regardless. The brick courthouse crumbled under direct hits from French 24-pounders. The Anglican church lost its steeple and most of its roof. Civilians huddled in basements and under upturned wagons. Some dug crude shelters into the riverbank below the bluffs. Children emerged only at night to scavenge for food scraps. The constant shriek of incoming shells frayed every nerve. No one slept for more than a few minutes at a stretch. The British officer corps felt the same desperation. Cornwallis ordered one final measure that underscored his hopelessness. He directed the scuttling of dozens of British vessels anchored in the York River. Sailors chopped holes through the hulls of transports, supply sloops, and armed schooners. The ships settled into the murky water with their cargoes still aboard. Barrels of salt pork, sacks of flour, crates of musket cartridges. All of it sank into the tidal mud rather than fall into Allied hands. The masts of sunken ships protruded from the river at drunken angles for days after. The scuttling destroyed vital supplies that could have sustained the army through negotiations. It also eliminated any remaining possibility of a waterborne escape. Hungry soldiers watched their last rations vanish beneath the brown water. Discord rippled through the Allied camp even as victory approached. French and American officers clashed repeatedly over precedence and protocol. French commanders believed their larger contingent and superior engineering entitled them to lead. American officers resented any implication that their army needed French rescue. Rochambeau and Washington maintained a careful diplomatic partnership. Their subordinates were less restrained. French officers mocked the ragged appearance of continental troops. American officers bristled at the condescension of aristocratic Frenchmen who had arrived late to the war. Arguments erupted over who would command which sections of the siege lines. Negotiations over the surrender ceremony itself became a minefield of wounded pride. The formal protocols of 18th century capitulation carried immense symbolic weight. Every gesture, every word, every placement of troops communicated status and honor. Washington insisted on terms identical to those the British had demanded at Charleston the previous year. The garrison would march out with colors furled and bands playing a British or German tune. Officers would be permitted to retain their sidearms. The army would then lay down its weapons under the eyes of the victors. Cornwallis attempted to negotiate for full honors of war. Washington refused flatly. The British commander then made a calculated decision to absent himself from the ceremony. He claimed illness, and he was genuinely exhausted and possibly unwell. But his non-appearance was also a deliberate snub. He would not personally face the humiliation of surrendering to a colonial army his king refused to recognize. He delegated the grim duty to his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara. The French and American commands now choreographed every step of what would follow. On the morning of October 17th, a sudden silence fell across the artillery batteries. The guns had been roaring for 8 days without pause. Then the smoke cleared over the British works. A red-coated drummer boy climbed onto the parapet of the hornwork. He beat the long roll, the signal for a parley. No one on the Allied side could hear the drum over the ringing in their ears, but they saw the white handkerchief waving beside him. A British officer stepped forward under a flag of truce. He carried a letter addressed to General Washington. The note was brief and direct. Cornwallis proposed a cessation of hostilities for 24 hours. He requested that commissioners be appointed to discuss terms of surrender. Washington read the letter on horseback near the forward batteries. He replied in writing within the hour. His answer granted a 2-hour truce, not 24. He demanded Cornwallis submit written proposals before the ceasefire could be extended. Cornwallis had no leverage left to negotiate. The British officers drafted their terms in a candlelit cellar. They requested full honors of war, the right to march out with colors flying. Washington's reply arrived the next day. The same honors granted to the American garrison at Charleston would be granted here. No more and no less. The garrison would become prisoners of war. Officers could keep their sidearms and personal baggage. Soldiers would ground their weapons in the field. British and German bands would play a tune of their own nation. The Articles of Capitulation were signed on the morning of October 19th. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the British Army began its final march. 7,000 men formed a column nearly a mile long. They moved between two walls of soldiers standing at rigid attention. French infantry in white uniforms lined the left side of the Hampton Road. American Continentals and militia lined the right. The French had polished their brass and powdered their wigs. The Americans stood in patched coats and mismatched hats. Many had no shoes at all. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The British and German troops marched with colors furled inside leather cases. Their drums beat a slow cadence that the American fifes did not answer. The band of the Royal Welch Fusiliers struck up a melody. Tradition later claimed it was a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." No contemporary officer recorded the title in his diary. The soldiers themselves were in no condition to remember. They had eaten little for weeks and slept less. Their faces were gaunt and hollow beneath their cocked hats. Some men openly wept as they walked. Others cursed under their breath and hurled their muskets onto the growing pile. The heavy Bess muskets clattered onto the field with enough force to crack stocks. Hessian mercenaries from Ansbach and Bayreuth stacked their arms in disciplined silence. Their green coats were stained with mud and dried blood. The entire column moved past the place where Major General Lincoln sat on horseback. O'Hara rode forward and offered his sword to Rochambeau. Rochambeau refused and gestured toward Washington. Washington refused as well. He directed O'Hara to General Lincoln. Lincoln took the sword, held it for a moment, and returned it. No one spoke the obvious truth aloud. The British officer corps understood it perfectly. This was the price of Charleston repaid in full view of two armies. More than 8,000 prisoners fell into Allied hands. The number included roughly 7,000 effectives and over 1,000 sick and wounded. The able-bodied marched to prison camps in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. The sick remained in improvised hospitals under French medical care. The prison camps were not built for the numbers they received. Barracks at Lancaster and York in Pennsylvania overflowed within weeks. Food rations shrunk as continental commissaries ran short of funds. Smallpox and typhus ignited inside the overcrowded stockades. Hundreds of British and German prisoners died before spring. Graves went unmarked in fields far from any churchyard. Many of the Hessians never saw their homelands again. The news of the surrender traveled by fast dispatch ship to Europe. It reached London on November 25th, a cold and rain-swept Monday. The messenger went straight to the house of Lord George Germain, the colonial secretary. Germain climbed into his carriage and rode to the residence of the Prime Minister, Lord North. When North heard the words, he paced his drawing room in visible agitation. According to witnesses, he threw his arms wide and exclaimed that it was all over. The phrase he used was seared into the political memory of the era. King George III received the dispatch shortly after. His initial shock gave way to stubborn refusal. He drafted a speech for Parliament declaring the war would continue. He insisted the loss of one army did not mean the loss of the colonies. The king still believed the bulk of the American population remained loyal. Parliament did not share his conviction. The opposition in the House of Commons had been gathering strength for 2 years. The war was bleeding the treasury of millions of pounds sterling. Taxes in Britain had risen to levels that enraged the gentry and the merchant class. The peace faction argued that America was a bottomless pit of expense. Yorktown gave them the weapon they needed. In late February of 1782, a motion in the Commons urged the king to end offensive operations. It passed by a narrow but decisive margin. All further attempts to recruit soldiers for North America were suspended. Lord North resigned on March 20th, 1782, ending his 12-year ministry. A new government under the Marquis of Rockingham took power. Rockingham's ministers were committed to ending the war on acceptable terms. Peace commissioners sailed for Paris in April. Negotiations dragged for more than a year. The American delegation included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They bargained against a backdrop of continued fighting in the Caribbean and India. France and Spain pressed for concessions that would weaken Britain permanently. The Americans, distrusting their own allies, opened separate discussions with the British. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. The new nation's boundaries stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Florida returned to Spanish control. Loyalists were promised restitution of property, a promise largely unfulfilled. The last British troops evacuated New York City on November 25, 1783. Washington resigned his commission to the Continental Congress in Annapolis a month later. The deed was done. The popular memory of that victory would grow simpler with each retelling, until the nuance was sanded away into myth.